Community resilience is an interesting concept. The root word of the word resilience comes from the Latin word resilio, which means to leap or spring back or to rebound. And that's really the core concept of what resilience is. Holling, back in 1973, defined resilience as a measure of the persistence of complex systems. And their ability to really absorb change and disturbances and still maintain the relationships, if you will. So it's really about the capacity of a system, for example, a social system, a combined social ecological system, to absorb the shocks and adapt in the face of change or disturbances, but to really maintain those key structures, those key functions. And those could be things like the relationships that exist in a community, the services that exist, the actual resources, whether they're human, technical, economic, information, education. So how do systems really maintain those really essential kinds of systems in the face of changes that may come about? So the types of disturbances, if you will, or shocks that a system might undergo are myriad. There are so many different types. So climate change is one that we're seeing that's really impacting communities across the globe. It could be things like population growth or population decline. I can talk about an example of that, where one of the communities that I'm working in lost about half of their population. So we see this in cities like Detroit in the United States. The city that I've been working in is Binghamton, New York. And so how does a city survive when they lose nearly half of their population, as well as a manufacturing base, so that it changes the economic systems within a community? And natural disasters are another disturbance that communities are having to address around the globe. And this is obviously something that's been going on since the beginning of time. But with climate change, we're seeing that the propensity of extreme weather events to occur is increasing. So there's an increasing likelihood that the storms and precipitation that communities are experiencing will be more intense and potentially more frequent. And so the challenge is, how do communities address natural disasters? And so that's a key area within resilience, is resilience planning. How do you plan for natural disasters? And that's something also that we've been working on in Binghamton, because not only did the city experience a loss of its manufacturing base, as well as a significant decline in population, but they were also hit with significant flooding events in 2006 and again in 2011. So this is a community that's really having to think very critically about what it means to be resilient and how they adapt and survive into the future. So a few of the changes that we've been investigating, the process of looking retrospectively after these changes happen, after the 2006 and 2011 floods. And one of the things that we've been finding in our research is that memory and history play a critical role in this idea of resilience. And so having experienced two major floods, we started to see real changes in the communication networks that were happening within the city. And so we started to see more collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. So for example, the nonprofit sector, they really mobilize to a significant extent during natural disasters to help communities. NGOs like Catholic Charities, Council of Churches, really thinking about community organizations assisting in disaster. This is a coalition of nonprofit organizations that really started as a result of thinking about how the kind of human services organizations could work together rather than in piecemeal during a natural disaster. And now we see that coalition of nonprofit organizations that really help communities recover after disasters and also prepare now has a memorandum of understanding with the county emergency services. So we're starting to see that these communication networks are growing, they're strengthening, and that's a really key part of it, because the public sector really relies a lot on cooperation with the private sector, the nonprofit organizations, as well as businesses during a natural disaster. So really thinking about how all of these networks interact as a set of what are called networked adaptive capacities. So one adaptive capacity for resilience is this idea of those that social capital, or those connections within a community. So disturbances often test the resilience of communities, and but that's not to say that the communities have to go through these disturbances in order to be resilient. And so I think that's one of the key factors that I'm working on, along with a number of colleagues across the globe. So the role for environmental educators in resilience, I think, is a pretty significant one, because different types of knowledge are required for resilience. And so I think that's where environmental educators can really come into play. Environmental education is really about helping build the capacity of communities to understand their environment. And that's a very important part of resilience, is kind of understanding not only the social systems, but really how they're embedded or integrated with our ecological ones. And so the wicked problems of our lifetime and the lives that will go before us are really contingent on us being able to build resilience. And I think that education is a big part of that. And I think it's also important to think about what knowledge or whose knowledge. And I would say that local and traditional knowledge is also very important, both in an indigenous context, which might be like the example that I talked about in Malaysia, but also in places like Binghamton, New York, and other cities and rural communities across the globe, is that it's important to understand how knowledge is produced, how it's recognized, and how it's prioritized. And I feel like that's another area that environmental educators can really play a role, is to making sure that all voices are part of that conversation, and really recognizing not only scientific knowledge, which is very critical, but also local and traditional knowledge, which is equally as important. And so those are kind of a couple of areas where I see educators really being significant in resilience.